Stepping on the Cracks by Mary Downing Hahn. Chapter 15. At 3:30 the next day, Elizabeth and I waited outside school for Gordy. Suspecting he'd been playing hooky, Mrs. Wagner had kept him in to catch up on his lessons. When he shoved the big green door open and saw Elizabeth and me, he frowned. "What are you jerks hanging around here for?" he said. "You want a punch in the face or something?" He walked down the steps, his fists clenched. He looked so menacing, I wanted to run. But Elizabeth grabbed my sleeve and stopped me from going anywhere. "Didn't I warn you, lizard?" Gordy shoved his face close to Elizabeth's. "Quit spying. You're going to ruin everything." Elizabeth's head tilted back, but she didn't budge. "Stuart wants us to help," she said. "He asked me to tell you." "Liar. He never said nothing like that." Gordy glared at her. "You want the army to get him. I bet you already told everybody in College Hill where he is." "Don't you dare call me a tattletale." Elizabeth stood on her tiptoes, making herself eye to eye with Gordy. "I feel sorry for Stuart. He's sick. He needs people to watch over him and bring him things. You can't do it all by yourself." Gordy sniffed and ran the back of his hand past his nose. The wind whipped his hair, and he looked cold and miserable. The scar above his eyebrow made a livid streak against his pale skin. For the first time, I wondered how he'd gotten it. "We can take food to him," Elizabeth went on, "and maybe even medicine. Suppose he dies. What would you do? Bury him in the woods all by your stupid self?" "You shut up." Gordy drew back one arm, and I thought for sure he was going to punch Elizabeth. She didn't even duck. She just stood there glaring at him, daring him to hurt her. Turning aside, Gordy shoved both his fists into his jacket pockets. He stood there for a few moments, his head down, his shoulders slumped. When he looked up, I thought I saw the glitter of tears in his eyes, but it was probably my imagination. "Okay," he muttered. "If Stuart really wants you to help, get some food and meet me at the hut." Yanking his bike out of the rack, he vaulted on like a cowboy and pedaled away. We watched him till he turned the corner by the trolley tracks, but he didn't look back. "Come on," Elizabeth ran across the playground, with me in pursuit. When we got to our block, she slowed down and pulled me close so she could whisper in my ear. "You get aspirin and cough syrup," she told me. "I'll bring food. Chicken soup with rice if we have it. Then meet me in the alley. Be sure no one sees you." I nodded and raced for home. Mother was in the kitchen listening to Stella Dallas while she fixed dinner. She was so absorbed in Stella's latest sorrow, she barely noticed me run up to my room. Changing my clothes as fast as I could, I slipped into the bathroom and grabbed a little bottle of aspirin and the cough medicine. Dropping them into my jacket pocket, I hurried down the hall and sauntered into the kitchen, trying to look like my ordinary everyday self, not a girl hiding stolen goods. "How about some Ovaltine to warm you up?" Mother asked. "Elizabeth's waiting for me," I said. Through the window in the back door, I could see her stamping the ice on a mud puddle. She liked the tinkling sound it made when it broke. Without giving Mother a chance to ask any more questions, I hurried out into the cold air and joined Elizabeth. "Did you get the medicine?" she asked me as we ran down the alley. When I nodded, Elizabeth said, "Good. I got some soup and a can of stew and a jar of applesauce. Nice, nourishing food. Maybe we can fatten Stuart up." By the time Elizabeth and I got to the hut, Gordy and Doug had lit a small campfire in the clearing. With stony faces, they watched us approach. Reaching into my pockets, I held the aspirin and cough medicine out like offerings. Without even saying thanks, Gordy grabbed the soup from Elizabeth and looked at the labels. While we watched, he opened a can, dumped the soup into a small pot, and plunked it down in the fire. Leaving him there, Elizabeth and I went into the hut. Stuart was lying on the cot, covered with blankets. His face was flushed, and his eyes were glittery. When he saw Elizabeth and me, he smiled and tried to sit up. The effort made him cough. "You look sicker," Elizabeth said, tactful as ever. She took the charcoal from me and poured some into a spoon. Like a little kid, Stuart opened his mouth wide, and Elizabeth tipped the medicine down his throat. "Ugh," he said. "The worse it tastes, the better it is for you," Elizabeth told him. "At least, that's what my mother always says." Next, she made him take 2 aspirins and drink a glass of water. "You'll be better soon," she told him. Stuart nodded. "You make it sound like a threat," he said, but he smiled to show her he was kidding. Then, the door thumped open, and Gordy came in carrying the pot of soup. "It's real hot," he told Stuart as he carefully set it on the orange crate table. Stuart stirred the soup and blew on a spoonful. When he swallowed, he winced as if it hurt his throat. After he'd eaten about half the soup, he lay down and pulled the covers up to his chin. "See," he said to Gordy, "I told you the girls would be a big help." Gordy didn't say anything. Without looking at Elizabeth or me, he bent over Stuart. "Should we go now?" he asked his brother. Stuart nodded. "You don't want the old man looking for you," he said. "Don't make him mad, Gordy. I'm not worth it." Silently, we followed Gordy outside. Doug had dumped water on the fire, and the smell of damp ashes lingered in the clearing. He and Gordy walked ahead of us through the trees, side by side, heads down, hands jammed in their pockets, saying nothing. They looked like old men. "We'll come again tomorrow," Elizabeth said, before the boys turned off in the direction of their homes. Gordy looked at us. "Stuart's getting sicker and sicker," he said, his voice rising until he was yelling at us. "Somebody should be with him all day, making sure he's okay. I can't keep missing school. Mrs. Wagner called my mother and she told my father. Do you know what he'll do to me if I play hooky again?" Elizabeth and I stared at Gordy. The sun was a red ball behind him, and his shadow stretched toward us, ending in a pinhead at our feet. "I'll do it," Elizabeth said. "I can forge a note from Mrs. Wagner. I'm real good at disguising my handwriting." She watched Gordy, waiting for his approval. He chewed his lower lip and studied the ground. Finally, he looked up and sighed. "Okay," he said, "but if anything goes wrong, it's your fault, Lizard. I'll personally make you very sorry." Elizabeth took a deep breath. I couldn't tell if she was relieved or scared. Looking Gordy in the eye, she said, "Nothing will go wrong." "It better not," Gordy said. Without another word, he and Doug trudged off into the sunset. Elizabeth and I watched them until they turned the corner. A gust of wind whipped my braids, and I shivered. "You can't go down there all by yourself," I said. "Why not?" Elizabeth tossed her hair out of her eyes. "Suppose your parents find out." "They won't," she said. "I'll come with you," I said, hardly daring to think about what I was saying. Elizabeth seized my hands and jumped up and down. "Oh, Margaret, that's great! I didn't think you would. I was scared even to ask you." Wondering what I've done, I watched Elizabeth run up her back steps. I never played hooky, and I was terrified of what might happen if we were caught. But I couldn't let Elizabeth do it all by herself. She was my friend, and I had to stick by her no matter what. Quietly, I slipped into the house, hoping Mother wouldn't take one look at me and know exactly what I was planning to do. My face always gave everything away. I needn't have worried. As usual, Mother was too busy to pay much attention to me. If I was quieter than normal at dinner, neither she nor Daddy noticed. They had more important things on their minds. The Germans had started a big campaign against us in France and Belgium, and things looked worse every day. Mrs. Wagner told us about it in school, pointing to a place on the map called the Ardennes. She said that was where we were fighting the Battle of the Bulge. According to Daddy, Jimmy was probably right in the middle of it, and he and Mother talked of nothing else. Chapter 16. The next morning, Elizabeth and I walked up Garfield Road, just as if it were an ordinary day. We were going to school. At the trolley tracks, though, we stopped and looked ahead. Way up the street, under a gray sky heavy with clouds, we saw Polly, Linda, and Judy. Ducking behind the telephone pole, we watched them pause to talk to Bruce and then run across the playground. As the cold wind swirled around me, I wished with all my heart that Elizabeth and I were with them. A screech of tires startled us. Whirling around, we saw Gordy on his bike. "You didn't tell me Baby Magpie was going with you," he said to Elizabeth. While I stood there wishing people would stop thinking I was a baby, Elizabeth leapt to my defense. Glaring at Gordy, she said, "Margaret's not going to blab on Stuart any more than I am." The wind blew Gordy's hair in and out of his eyes, and he tossed his head to the side, considering Elizabeth and me. "Just make sure nobody follows you," he said at last. "As soon as school's out, me and Toad and Doug will come down there, and you can go home." Gordy looked around as if he expected to see spies everywhere, just waiting to catch Stuart. "Go on," he said, "before I change my mind and sock you a good one." He pedaled toward school, glancing back from time to time to scowl at us. Checking to make sure there were no tattletales in sight, Elizabeth and I ran down the trolley tracks, putting a couple of streets between us and Garfield before we cut up an alley toward the woods. By the time we got to the hut, we were out of breath and freezing cold. Stuart was lying so still under a pile of ragged blankets, I was afraid we were too late. But when Elizabeth bent over him, he opened his eyes and smiled at her. "Well, well," he said, "look who's here, the angel of the battlefield." His voice was low and husky, and his eyes were bright and sparkly. Despite his beard and long shaggy hair, he looked very handsome, but I remembered Mother telling me once I looked too pretty to be well. Sticking a thermometer in my mouth, she'd put me to bed. Sure enough, my rosy cheeks and bright eyes were the result of a high fever, and I'd spent the next couple of weeks in bed with strep throat. Relying on what we'd learned in Girl Scouts, Elizabeth and I managed to get a fire going so we could make some tea for Stuart, and after he drank it, he looked better, but he was coughing a lot. Elizabeth and I had used the money we'd been saving for Christmas presents to buy 3 boxes of cough drops and a big bottle of charcoal. After pouring a couple of spoonfuls of cough syrup down his throat, Elizabeth gave Stuart a handful of little yellow lozenges and sat down beside him. "Tell me something," Elizabeth stared at Stuart. "Did you go all the way through boot camp and then change your mind about fighting?" Stuart shut his eyes for a moment, as if he were trying to remember something that had happened a long, long time ago. "I didn't want to serve in the army," he said, "and I was thinking about becoming a conscientious objector or something. While I was making up my mind, I got drafted. And then I thought maybe I should be in the army like everybody else. I never hated anything so much in my whole life. I thought about the funny letters Jimmy sent us from boot camp. He'd made Fort Benning sound like a joke, but maybe if you were actually there doing all that stuff, you wouldn't find it so comical, especially if you weren't good at sports or fighting." "Finally, I came home on furlough," Stuart went on, "but I knew the next step would be a ship going to Europe. Then I got this letter from Donald. It was different from the ones he sent the old man. He told me his outfit shot down 3 or 4 English planes by mistake, and then fired on one of our own divisions. He said it happened all the time. They were always making mistakes, shelling towns, killing civilians, families." Stuart coughed long and hard. When he stopped, he reached under his cot and pulled out a metal box. In it was a letter, written on familiar V-mail stationery, creased and recreased from being read over and over again. Stuart smoothed it out, and read, "Don't believe that patriotic stuff about dying for your country. All me and my buddies want to do is get out of this mess alive. War is nothing but killing people before they kill you, and it's more awful than anything you can imagine." "Donald wrote that?" Elizabeth stared at Stuart. Stuart put the letter back in his box and coughed again, even harder this time. He lay back on his cot and closed his eyes. "There's no way I can believe war is the answer to anything," he said. Elizabeth and I looked at each other. Nobody said a word. Jimmy never wrote about the war itself, though sometimes, like Mother said, he sounded unhappy and homesick. Was he keeping thoughts like Donald's to himself? I wanted to ask Stuart if the war was like that for everybody in Europe, but he was asleep. He wasn't coughing, but his breath was loud and rattly. The noise of it filled up the hut and scared me. Looking at the pile of sticks by the little stove, I decided to go outside and gather more. When I opened the door, I was surprised to see snow whirling down from the sky. It lay like gauze on the brown leaves curled at my feet and closed in around the hut like a thick white curtain. The wind-driven flakes stung my face and bare legs as I searched the ground for dead wood. When I had an armful, I went back inside. Stuart was asleep, so I put the pile down quietly. "Guess what?" I whispered to Elizabeth. "It's snowing like mad." Pressing our faces against one of the little windows, we watched the snow fall. The flakes whirled through the air so thickly we could barely see the trees surrounding the hut. "Maybe it's a blizzard," Elizabeth said softly, "and we'll be stranded here." Around noon, we made soup and practically forced Stuart to eat it. After he'd finished, we picked up a book, but the effort of holding it tired him out, so Elizabeth offered to read it to him. He smiled at her. "That's something Gordy can't do," he said. "He hates to read." Stuart handed Elizabeth an old high school literature book. "I've had it since 12th grade," he said, as she looked at the faded blue and gray cover. Read me some poetry. There's one in there I like a lot, The Man He Killed, by Thomas Hardy." Elizabeth checked the table of contents, then turned to a page near the back of the book and began to read. "Had he and I but met by some old ancient inn, we should have sat us down to write many a nipperkin." Elizabeth stumbled on nipperkin and giggled. Write many a nipperkin? What does that mean?" "Drink a mug of beer," Stuart said. "A half pint, like in England." That made us both laugh, but Stuart asked Elizabeth to go on with the poem. "It's not funny," he said. Trying hard to stop giggling, Elizabeth read the rest. Stuart was right. It was a sad poem about a soldier who killed a man he might have been friends with if he hadn't been his enemy in war. "That's what war does to people," Stuart said. "It turns them into killers." "But if Thomas Hardy hadn't killed that man, the man would have killed him," Elizabeth said. "They both shot at each other. It says so right here." She stabbed at a line in a verse with her index finger and frowned. Stuart leaned toward Elizabeth and me. He looked very earnest. "But suppose they hadn't," he asked. "Suppose they'd thrown their guns down and said, 'This war is really dumb, let's go get a beer.'" Elizabeth shook her head. "Stuart, I just don't think that would happen." "You never know till you try." Stuart said. Should I read some more poems? Elizabeth asked. Stuart coughed and shook his head. No, he mumbled. I think I'll take another nap. He closed his eyes, and Elizabeth and I sat quietly, watching him sleep. Cautiously, Elizabeth leaned over and laid her palm against his forehead. Turning to me, she said, He's just burning up, Margaret. I think he's got a high fever. From outside, we heard Gordy yelling something to Doug. The door of the hut opened, and Gordy stopped on the threshold with Doug and Toad behind him. At the sight of us huddled beside Stuart, they shut the door, quietly, keeping out the snow gusting in behind them. Stuart's really sick, Elizabeth whispered. Gordy bent over the cot, and Stuart opened his eyes. They are my angels of the battlefield, he said, pointing at Elizabeth and me. Don't know what I'd do without them. Stuart's voice was raspy, and his eyes were even more fever-bright. When he started coughing, Gordy brushed past Elizabeth and bent over him. You're worse, he said. No, Stuart said. The angels make me better. Their wings are so white and they sing so sweet. Don't worry. Stay out of the street. Don't make the old man mad. Don't let him see you. His voice was barely a whisper. Just the angels. That's all we need, the angels. You'll see after the war is over, after they've all gone home. Stuart closed his eyes and Gordy looked at Elizabeth. What's the matter with him? What's he talking about? Elizabeth shook her head. I think he's delirious because of the fever. My heart sped up again. Delirious? I'd read books where people were delirious from fever. I remembered little Ava's death in Uncle Tom's cabin. She'd seen the angels coming down from heaven. Suppose Stuart was about to die. I started crying. I couldn't help it. Shut up, magpie! Gordy turned on me then. His face was dead white, and his voice was tight from all the anger squeezed into it. We don't need no crybabies making things worse. I'm so cold, Stuart muttered. So cold. Isn't the war over yet? I want to go home. I want Mom. But the old man is there. He won't go away. Why can't it all be over? He struggled to sit up, but Gordy pushed him back down. Just lie still, he said. Lie still, Stuart, and get better. Please, get better. Stuart didn't seem to hear Gordy. I have to go home, he said. Can't kill, can't do it, don't want to see it. Wrong, all wrong, must be something I can do. Make the shooting stop, make it stop. Stuart, it's me, Gordy said. He tried to keep him from getting up, but Stuart was fighting him. Help me, he yelled to Doug and Toad. They grabbed Stuart's shoulders and shoved him down, but as he fell back, he kicked out hard and sent his literature book flying. Elizabeth picked it up and clasped it against her chest. I was scared. From the way Stuart was acting, you would have thought we were his enemies, not his friends. In the midst of all the turmoil, Stuart started coughing so hard he couldn't struggle any more. He coughed till he could barely breathe, and then he lay still. Slowly, his eyes traveled from face to face, studying each of us. The tension went out of him, and he closed his eyes. Is he asleep? Elizabeth whispered. Gordy leaned over his brother and stared at him. He nodded, and then he motioned for us to follow him outside. The ground was white now, and the snow was still falling thick and fast, closing around us like a cloak. From its perch on a limb high overhead, a crow cawed once, and then lifted itself into the air. I watched it fly away, its shape blurred by the falling snow. Stuart needs a doctor, Elizabeth said. Her words came out in angry puffs of white smoke. Did I ask you to butt your nose into my business? Gordy asked. When I want your opinion, I'll ask for it, Lizard. She's right, Gordy, Doug said. He can't stay here. He's getting sicker and sicker. Suppose he busts out of there and tries to go home, Toad asked. Your old man would kill him. What do you think the army will do to him? Gordy had tears in his eyes. Give him a medal for deserting? Well, we have to do something, Elizabeth yelled. We can't just let him die. The five of us stood there staring at each other. The snow swirled around us as if it were never going to stop, blotting out the tops of the trees and drifting against the hut. Elizabeth's words lingered in the air, but no one spoke. If only I really were an angel of the battlefield, I thought. I'd make the war stop. I'd make it safe for Stuart to go home. I'd make it safe for Jimmy and Joe, too. I'd make it safe for all the little children in the world and their mothers and their fathers and their grandparents. But I wasn't an angel of the battlefield, and neither was Elizabeth. I didn't know what to do, and neither did anybody else.